Hello, and welcome to Night Drive Stories. My name's Jack, and I drive the silent highways of the Pacific Northwest long after midnight, picking up those who wander these misty roads. Tonight, let me tell you the story I heard from the stranger I picked up just outside the old truck stop at mile marker 99. He wasn't a typical wanderer. He looked like he'd been pulled from the cab of a Peterbilt, not from the shoulder of the road. He wore a faded flannel jacket, worn-out jeans, and boots that had seen a million miles of asphalt and diesel-soaked gravel. There was an air of profound exhaustion about him, but underneath it, something else flickered in his eyes. A deep, resonant fear, the kind you don't get from a close call with a deer or a blown tire. He said his name was Sal. He'd been a long-haul trucker for 30 years. I asked him where his rig was. He just shook his head and stared out at the passing pines, their tips silvered by the moonlight. It took a few miles of silence, the hum of my engine the only sound between us, before he was ready to tell me why. Part 1. The second first time. It started 2 nights ago, Sal began, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that seemed to harmonize with the road. Or maybe it started last night. That's the whole problem, see? I can't be sure anymore. He was on his usual route, a long, lonesome haul from Omaha to Denver, cutting straight through the gut of Nebraska on I-80. It's a road that can play tricks on you, especially at 3 in the morning when the world shrinks to the twin beams of your headlights and the hypnotic pulse of the dashed white lines. The endless flat horizon, punctuated by the same repeating silos and ghostly farmhouses, can make time feel like a loop. You see the same set of headlights in your mirror for an hour and start to wonder if you're moving at all, or if you're just a static image in some forgotten god's slideshow. I was feeling the burn, Sal said, rubbing his eyes as if the memory itself tired him out. He described the feeling with painful precision, the gritty sensation behind the eyeballs, the way the caffeine from 3 hours ago turns to acid in your gut, the dull ache that settles deep in your lower back. The radio was just spitting static and fire and brimstone preachers. Some guy was hollering about the thief in the night, about how your soul gets snatched right out from under you when you're not looking. Usually I just tune it out. It's all part of the night soundtrack. But this time it felt different. It felt like a warning. He pushed on, trying to shake the feeling, focusing on the familiar drone of his Cummins engine. That's when he saw him. A lone figure standing at the edge of his high beams, just past an on-ramp that looked like it hadn't been used since the Dust Bowl. It was just a silhouette at first, impossibly still against the vast, empty backdrop of the plains. He had one hand raised, thumb out, in a gesture so casual it was unnerving. Not desperate, not frantic, just waiting, patiently. Now, I don't make a habit of picking up hitchers, Sal reiterated, his voice firm. It's a rule my wife Maria made me swear to 30 years ago when we were just starting out. She made me promise on her father's Bible. A man I knew from the yards, name of Rusty, picked up the wrong guy outside of Flagstaff. They found his rig jackknifed in a ditch 3 days later. Trailer split open like a burst melon. No sign of Rusty. Not then, not ever. That story stuck with me. But this felt different. Sal couldn't explain why. He told me it was the man's stillness that got to him. He looked less like a person in trouble and more like a landmark, a permanent feature of that desolate stretch of road. Before his conscious mind could even process the decision, his foot was already moving from the accelerator to the brake. He was gearing down, the big rig's air brakes letting out a long, mournful hiss as he pulled over onto the gravel shoulder. The entire time, a frantic voice in the back of his head, a voice that sounded a lot like his wife's, was screaming, "What in God's name are you doing, Sal? What would Maria say?" But he ignored it. An inexplicable feeling of compulsion, as strong and sure as a current, had taken hold. It felt necessary, predestined almost. The man opened the cab door and slid into the passenger seat without a word of struggle, bringing in a gust of cold, clean air that smelled of damp earth, cornfields, and the kind of deep night you only find miles from any city glow. He was slight, wiry, with a face that seemed both ancient and boyish at the same time, etched with lines that didn't seem to come from age, but from a profound weariness. He wore a plain gray work shirt and dark pants, clothes that were clean but worn thin. But it was his eyes that truly captivated Sal. They were a pale, placid blue, the color of a winter sky. And they looked at him not with gratitude, but with a serene, unnerving sense of calm recognition. "Thanks for the lift," he said. His voice was soft, gentle, devoid of the grit and gravel Sal expected from someone living on the road. "Don't mention it," Sal grunted, wrestling the heavy rig back onto the interstate. "Name's Sal. Where you headed?" "Just a ways up the road." "I'll let you know the place," the man said, settling into the seat as if it were molded for him. "My name is Elias." They drove in silence for a few miles, the landscape outside a black, featureless void. Sal was on edge, the transgression against his long-held rule sitting heavy in his stomach. He was waiting for the other shoe to drop. The request for money, the sob story, the sudden twitchiness that signals trouble. But Elias just sat there perfectly still, watching the broken white lines being eaten by the truck. Then he spoke again, his voice cutting through the engine's drone with quiet precision, and the bottom dropped out of Sal's world. "I really appreciate you stopping for me again, Sal," he said, his tone as casual as if he were remarking on the weather. Sal shot a look at him, his brow furrowed. "Come again?" "I said thanks for stopping again," Elias repeated, his pale eyes fixed on Sal's face. "I honestly wasn't sure you would. You seemed pretty spooked when you dropped me off last night." Sal stared, his mind struggling to process the words. The truck drifted a little, kissing the rumble strip with a loud brrrr-tee that jolted him back. He jerked the wheel, his heart suddenly hammering against his ribs. "Last night? Fella, I think you got me mixed up with someone else. I've never laid eyes on you before in my life." Elias offered a small, sad little smile, a look of profound pity. "You're right in a way. You haven't, not tonight anyway." He then gave a slight nod toward Sal's sun visor. Tucked into the worn elastic band was a faded photograph of Maria, taken 20 years ago at a state fair. Her dark hair is windswept and she's laughing, a real, unbridled laugh of pure joy. It was his favorite picture of her. He never, ever took it out. It was his private totem against the loneliness of the road. "You looked at that picture a lot last night, too," Elias said softly. "Right after you told me her name was Maria and that her laugh sounds like wind chimes." A cold dread, slick and oily, slithered down Sal's spine. He'd never felt a fear like it in his 30 years on the road. It wasn't the fear of a knife in his ribs or a blowout on a mountain pass. It was the terrifying, intimate fear of his own mind turning against him, of the walls of his reality beginning to buckle. He was a man of routine. His logbook was his Bible. His memory was his compass. And his memory was telling him, screaming at him with absolute certainty, that this man was a liar. But his gut, in a way that defied all reason, was telling him he wasn't. Part 2. The Unremembered Conversation. "So," Jack's voice cut through the quiet of the car, pulling me from the story's chilling grip. He'd been listening with a focused intensity, his knuckles ghost white on the steering wheel. "He knew your wife's name, and what she sounded like. But you're positive, absolutely positive you'd never seen him." I let out a long, shuddering breath and nodded, the motion feeling heavy, like my head was full of lead. "Jack, you gotta understand. A trucker's memory is his life, the routes, the schedules, the logbooks. It's a litany you repeat day in, day out. It's carved into you. I am as positive as I am that my name is Sal. I've driven that route hundreds of times. My logs are meticulous. I fuel up at the same pilot in Kearney. I sleep at the same Flying J in North Platte. There was no hitchhiker the night before. There was no unscheduled stop the night before. Period. End of story." "Then how?" Jack asked, the question hanging in the air between us. "That's the question that broke me, isn't it?" I said, turning back to the rain-streaked window. That's what I asked him. How the hell he knew her name. How he knew anything. My hands had clamped down on the steering wheel of my rig so hard my fingers ached. The cab, which had always felt like my own little kingdom, my rolling fortress of solitude, suddenly felt like a cage, and I was locked inside it with something that operated on rules I couldn't comprehend. "Who the hell are you?" I demanded, my voice tight and strained, barely a whisper. The fear inside me was starting to curdle into a hot, defensive anger. It was easier to be angry than to be terrified. Elias didn't flinch. He just kept watching me with those placid, impossibly old eyes. "I told you, Sal, I'm Elias, and I'm just a traveler, like you, passing through." "Don't you give me that metaphysical crap," I snarled. "How do you know my wife's name? Were you spying on me at a truck stop? Did you follow me?" The question sounded flimsy and desperate even to my own ears. Elias just shook his head, a slow, deliberate motion. "You told me. We had a long talk last night. You were feeling lonely, tired. The static on the radio was getting to you. You started talking about her. You said you measure your trips in the number of phone calls you have with her. You told me about the life you wished you'd had sometimes, the one where you stayed home and bought that little plot of land outside of town. You told me about the scare you had back in '08, the one with the black ice just outside of North Platte." He paused, and his voice dropped even lower, reciting my own history back to me. "You described the way the trailer began to fishtail, a slow, sickening slide. How everything went quiet, the way the world seems to hold its breath right before the crash. And for a single crystal-clear second, you were sure you were going to die, and your only thought was that you were going to see Maria again on the other side." Every word was a perfectly aimed hammer blow, shattering the foundations of my sanity. He was recounting, with chilling, verbatim accuracy, the private, anxious thoughts that circle my brain during the long, dark hours on the road. The near miss on the ice. I hadn't spoken about the full reality of that to another living soul, not even Maria. I'd buried it deep, a private trauma that fueled my caution on the winter roads. To hear it coming from the mouth of this placid stranger was obscene. It was a psychic violation of the deepest kind. "You're lying," I whispered, but the words had no force. They were just puffs of air. My own body was betraying me, siding with him. As he talked, I became aware that my thumb had started tapping its old restless rhythm against the top of the steering wheel. Thump, 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 thump. A nervous habit I've had since I was a kid trying to lie my way out of trouble. Elias's pale gaze drifted down to my hand, and that small, sad smile touched his lips again. "You were doing that last night too," he said gently. "Right before you started telling me about your grandfather's farm, the one with the big oak tree by the creek." A wave of vertigo washed over me, the highway lights smeared into streaks of yellow and white. The farm. My God, the farm. My grandfather's farm, the one we lost to the bank when I was 16, the formative wound of my youth. The reason I started driving in the first place, chasing a freedom that always seemed to be one more mile down the road. I had been thinking about it just an hour before I saw him, a wave of bittersweet nostalgia brought on by the sight of a passing field of corn. Had I been thinking about it? Or had I been remembering talking about it with him? The lines were blurring, fracturing. The solid ground of my own mind was turning to quicksand. "I don't talk about the farm," I said, my voice hoarse. "To anyone." "You did," Elias insisted, his voice unwavering, a calm anchor in my sea of confusion. "Memory is a funny thing out here on these long stretches, Sal. The road is hungry. An old-timer told me that once. He said these interstates, they aren't just paved over the land. They're paved over people's lives. Old homesteads, family cemeteries, old creeks, old memories. He said the road gets a little greedy sometimes. It can eat time, if you let it. It can swallow a whole day, a whole night, and leave you with nothing but a feeling that something is missing, a phantom limb of lost time." I wanted to scream at him, to open the door and throw him out of my truck at 80 miles an hour. But I couldn't. I was paralyzed by a terrifying new possibility that was taking root in the fertile soil of my fear. What if he wasn't lying? What if my brain, worn down by 30 years of sleepless nights, bad coffee, and endless miles, had finally quietly broken? What if I had picked him up last night, had a long, soul-bearing conversation born of exhaustion and loneliness, and my mind, to protect itself, had just deleted the tape? The idea of my own internal failure was almost more frightening than the uncanny stranger sitting next to me. "I don't remember you," I said, One last desperate attempt to hold on to the ledge of my own reality. I don't remember any of it. I know, Elias said, and for the first time, there was a clear note of something like pity in his voice, the sympathy of a doctor for a patient who refuses to accept a terminal diagnosis. But you will. You're a man who needs to see things to believe them. A man of solid ground and physical proof. That's why you stopped again tonight. You couldn't leave the gap. You needed to finish the drive. Prove it to yourself one way or another. He paused, then pointed his slender finger out the windshield into the impenetrable dark ahead. You're almost there. Just another 20 miles. Part 3. The missing stop in the crooked spire. Almost where? I asked, my voice barely a croak, sandpaper raw. The anger had evaporated completely, scoured away by a rising tide of pure, elemental dread. My truck, my sanctuary for 3 decades, now felt like a borrowed and haunted space. The familiar scent of coffee, worn vinyl, and diesel was tainted with something else underneath. The charged electric scent of ozone before a lightning strike. The smell of reality tearing at the seams. The place you dropped me off, Elias said, his voice maddeningly calm. The Shepherd's Rest. I let out a dry, humorless bark of a laugh. It was a reflex, the last gasp of my rational mind, trying to assert itself against the impossible. Kid, you're mistaken. I told you. There is nothing out here for another 50 miles but corn, cows, and the occasional grain silo. The next stop with any kind of motel is Kearney, and that's a good hour east. I know this road better than I know the lines on my own hand. Do you, Sal? Elias countered, his tone gentle but sharp, like a doctor probing a wound to test for nerve response. Do you really look at it anymore? Or do you just see the road you expect to see? You drive with your memory, not your eyes. You see the mile markers, the wait station signs, the green exit boards. But the landscape itself, the actual earth you're passing over, it's just a blur to you, a space to be crossed. Have you ever really looked out there, into the dark? His words hit me harder than a physical blow because they were true. After 3 decades, driving wasn't a conscious act anymore. It was an ingrained rhythm, a fusion of man and machine operating on muscle memory and instinct. The landscape was just a backdrop, a 2-dimensional film strip rolling past my window. I wasn't really there in it. I was just passing through. Elias seemed to sense my internal crisis, the collapsing of my certainty. He fell silent again, letting his accusation hang in the thick air of the cab. We drove on, the engine's drone the only sound, a monotonous hum that seemed to be counting down to something. I tried to focus on the road, to find something familiar and solid to anchor my spiraling mind. But everything now seemed suspect. Was that farmhouse there last week? It looked older, more dilapidated than I remembered. Has that line of skeletal cottonwood trees always been that close to the shoulder? Doubt was a poison, and it was now coursing through every vein. The static on the radio, which had faded, now seemed to be growing louder again, a sibilant whispering just beneath the threshold of hearing. There, Elias said suddenly, his voice cutting through my thoughts. He raised a slender finger, a pale sliver in the dashboard glow, and pointed toward the horizon, far to the right of the highway. You can just see it now, between the hills. I followed his finger, squinting into the pre-dawn gloom, my eyes aching from strain. The landscape was a flat, featureless expanse of dark earth meeting a bruised purple sky. There's nothing there but a radio tower, I said, my patience worn down to a single, frayed thread. Look closer, Sal, he urged, his voice soft but insistent. Don't look for what you expect to see. Just look. And then I saw it. And it wasn't a radio tower. At first I thought it was an optical illusion, a trick of the light in my exhausted mind, a tall, lone, dead tree. But as the truck chewed up another mile of asphalt, its shape became clearer, resolving itself out of the deep darkness. It was a spire, a church spire, but it was all wrong. It was too thin, too sharp, less like a symbol of faith and more like a black needle aimed at the heart of the heavens. And it was crooked, tilted at a sickening, unnatural angle, as if the very earth that held its foundation had grown weary and shrugged, letting it lean toward ruin. A cold sweat broke out across my forehead and trickled down my temples. I felt a tremor start in my hands. I had driven this exact stretch of I-80 1,000 times, in the blinding sun of summer and the whiteout blizzards of winter. By day and by night, I had never, not once, seen a church out there. I would have remembered. It was impossible. A structure that distinct, that unsettling? It couldn't be there. And yet, there it was, a black spike hammered into the soft fabric of the horizon. "You see it now, don't you?" Elias asked softly, and there was no triumph in his voice, only a quiet finality. I couldn't answer. My throat was too tight. I could only stare, my knuckles white on the wheel, my breath caught in my chest. The sight of it felt like a violation of natural law. It was like looking at your own familiar hand and suddenly seeing a sixth finger sprout from the knuckle. The world itself was tilting, just like that spire, and I was losing my balance. "That's the steeple of the chapel at the Shepherd's Rest," Elias explained, his voice a calm murmur against the frantic thrumming of my own blood. "The motel itself is nestled down at the base of it. You can't see it from the highway. Too low. The turnoff is just ahead, a little service road. Easy to miss if you aren't looking for it, or if you've been made to forget it." The implication hung there, heavy and menacing. He was laying out the path. He was giving me the choice to either slam my foot on the accelerator, to flee this glitch in reality and get the hell away from him, away from that impossible spire, or to turn the wheel and drive straight into the heart of the madness. Part of me, the sane part, the part that wanted to grow old with Maria, screamed to keep driving, to drop this man at the next well-lit town and never ever look back. But another part, a deeper, more desperate part that was now in control, needed to know. I had to know if I was losing my mind or if something else, something far worse was happening to me. The fear of the unknown was being rapidly overtaken by the sheer terror of not knowing. Without making a conscious decision, I saw my own hand move with a dreamlike autonomy, flicking on the right turn signal. The rhythmic, clicking sound filled the cab, loud as a ticking clock. Each green flash on the dashboard was a countdown to a choice I was no longer sure I was making for myself. The impossible spire grew closer, a dark finger beckoning me off the road I knew, and onto the one I had, apparently, terrifyingly, forgotten. Part 4. The detour into yesterday. Jack's voice was strained, barely above a whisper. "And you turned? You actually took the exit?" "It wasn't an exit," I said, my gaze fixed on the rain-slicked road ahead of us now, so different from the dry Nebraska plains of my memory, yet just as lonely. It was barely even a road, just a whisper of gravel and packed dirt peeling off into the darkness, like a faint scar on the land. The highway sign for it was rotted through, hanging from a single rusty nail creaking in the wind. The letters were all but gone, flaked away by decades of sun and neglect. But in the sweep of my headlights, I could just make out the ghost of the words, "Shepherd's Rest. No services." The moment my front tires left the smooth, predictable asphalt of the interstate and bit into the loose gravel of that service road, the world changed. The temperature in the cab seemed to drop 10 degrees in an instant. The omnipresent hum of the highway faded behind us with an alarming suddenness, replaced by an unnerving, profound silence, broken only by the crunch of stones under my wheels and the low, laboring rumble of my engine. The powerful beams of my headlights, which could pierce a quarter-mile of darkness on the open road, seemed weak and pathetic here, barely able to push back the oppressive ink-black darkness that crowded in from all sides. The endless cornfields gave way to a tangled skeletal wood of thirsty-looking trees, their bare branches clawing at the sides of my trailer as I passed, making a sound like fingernails scraping down a chalkboard. Elias was completely, utterly silent now. He had said his piece. His role, it seemed, was simply to get me to make the turn. The rest was up to me. I was driving with a grim, fatalistic determination, a moth drawn to a flame I knew would incinerate me. The questions had boiled away, leaving behind a single terrifying imperative. I had to see this through to its end. I had to see the place I supposedly was last night, to stand on the ground of my forgotten sin. My mind, in a desperate, frantic attempt to find a rational explanation, a foothold in reality, began digging through the deep archives of my memory, pulling out scraps of old stories, Ghost tales swapped over greasy spoons and crackling CB radios in the dead of night. And then I found it. A story I'd heard years ago from an old-timer in Cheyenne, a man named Pops who claimed he'd been driving since the roads were dirt. He called it the tale of the disappearing preacher, or the hungry chapel. The legend went that sometime in the late 70s, a charismatic, hollow-eyed preacher had wandered into this desolate part of Nebraska. His name, Pops had claimed, was Silas. And he promised his followers something more potent than salvation. He promised them rest, a release from the crushing weight of their memories, the shame of their pasts, the fear of their futures. He built a small, crude chapel and a few cabins for his followers, who were mostly transients, long-haul truckers at the end of their ropes, drifters, people who were already ghosts in the system. And then, one day, they were all gone. The whole community, preacher included, just vanished between one sunrise and the next. The state police checked it out, found the place eerily clean. No signs of a struggle, no bodies, no notes, just an abandoned settlement. They chalked it up to a fly-by-night flock of lost souls that had simply flown away. The place was forgotten, swallowed by the plains and the passage of time. I'd always thought it was just a trucker's yarn, I murmured, more to myself than to Jack. A spooky story to make the miles go by. Another piece of road folklore to keep you awake on the long stretches. But as I navigated the winding, overgrown path, the folklore was taking on the terrifying, tangible weight of reality. The crooked spire was my only guide now, a constant dark landmark against a starless sky. I could feel the truck straining, the grade steeper than it looked. A deeply unsettling sense of awful familiarity began to creep over me, cold and certain. I knew, with a certainty that defied all logic and reason, that a sharp, blind left turn was coming up, followed by a sudden dip in the road where a low-lying creek bed always flooded after a rain. My foot moved to the brake before my brain gave the command. I slowed, and there it was, the turn, the dip, just as I'd known it would be. The knowledge wasn't in my head, it was in my hands, in my muscles. I hadn't just heard about this place. I had been here. The dread wasn't just a feeling anymore. It was a physical presence in the cab. It was a pressure in my ears, a cold, heavy weight in my stomach. The air smelled of damp earth, rotting wood, and something else. Something metallic and vaguely sweet, like old blood. Elias sat unmoving in the passenger seat, his face a pale, impassive mask in the dim green glow of the dashboard lights. He wasn't a hitchhiker, he was a guide, a ferryman. And he was leading me back to a shore I had already visited and paid a toll to forget. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of navigating that forgotten road, the grasping trees fell away, opening into a wide, barren clearing. And there it was, the Shepherd's Rest. It was a skeleton in the moonlight. A handful of squat cabins, their roofs caved in, stood like rotten teeth around a weed-choked courtyard. At the center of it all was the chapel, its walls still standing but its windows dark and empty, like the vacant eye sockets of a skull. And above it all, the crooked spire, leaning against the sky like a broken bone. A silent testament to a faith that had gone terribly wrong. The place radiated a silence so profound, it felt like a sound in itself. A low, soul-deep hum of absolute emptiness. And yet, I knew, with that same chilling, inexplicable certainty, that it wasn't empty at all. Part 5. The congregation at the rest. I brought the rig to a halt at the edge of the clearing, letting the engine idle. Its familiar, powerful rumble sounded like a sacrilege in the crushing, holy silence of that place. The Shepherd's Rest was a ruin, no doubt about it. Moss grew in thick, velvety patches on the crumbling foundations, and time had eaten away at the wood until it was the color of old bone. But it was a clean ruin. There was no graffiti, no beer cans, no litter, none of the usual signs of teenage vandalism or vagrant habitation you'd expect in a place so utterly abandoned. It was just preserved in its decay, as if it were a museum exhibit of despair. "This is it," Elias said, his first words since we'd left the highway. They landed in the quiet cab with the weight of stones. He unbuckled his seatbelt with a deliberate click. "Thank you for the ride, Sal." Both times. He opened his door and stepped out into the night, not waiting for a reply. He moved with a strange, gliding grace, his feet making no sound on the cracked, dry earth. I watched him, my hand hovering over the gear shift, every sane instinct I possessed screaming at me to put the truck in reverse and lay a strip of rubber all the way back to the interstate. But I was frozen, pinned to my seat by a morbid fascination, mesmerized by the sheer wrongness of the scene unfolding before me. Elias walked toward the gaping, doorless maw of the chapel. As he reached the threshold, he turned back to look at me one last time. He raised a hand, not in a wave of farewell, but in a clear, unambiguous gesture of invitation. And then, as if summoned by his gesture, a light began to glow from within the roofless building. It wasn't a warm light, not the flickering orange of a fire or a lantern. It was a cold, sterile silver light, like moonlight that had been distilled, amplified, and given a malevolent intelligence. It didn't illuminate, it exposed. And in that spectral silver light, I saw them. They were standing inside the chapel's skeletal walls, arranged in neat, orderly rows like a silent congregation awaiting a sermon. There were maybe 20 of them, men and women, young and old. I could make out a young woman in a faded floral dress that might have been pretty once, her hands clasped before her. I saw an old man with a long, tangled gray beard that reached his chest, his eyes fixed on something far away. They were all dressed in simple, worn clothes, much like Elias's, and they were just standing there, utterly, profoundly motionless, staring straight ahead at the crumbling altar at the far end of the chapel. Their faces were blank canvases, scrubbed clean of any expression or emotion. They were hollowed out, their eyes like smudges of charcoal in pale, placid faces. They weren't ghosts, not in the traditional sense. They were more solid than that, and yet they felt less real. They were like photographs of people, left out in the sun for so long that all the color and life and feeling had been bleached away. My blood ran cold, turning to slush in my veins. This was the cult, the preacher's vanished flock. They hadn't vanished at all. They had just stopped. Elias walked into the chapel, his form silhouetted against the eerie light. He took his place in an open spot in the third row, turning to face the altar. As he joined the line, his form seemed to shimmer for a moment, the edges of him blurring and losing their definition, like a television signal struggling to resolve. Then he settled into the same profound, stony stillness as the others. He was one of them. My terrified gaze was drawn to another empty spot, this one in the back row near the entrance. As I stared at that patch of empty earth, the world seemed to warp and buckle. The air in the cab grew thick and heavy, and a high-pitched, piercing ringing filled my ears. The dashboard lights, the steering wheel, the windshield, it all melted away like wax, and I was suddenly standing there, in that empty spot, looking at the backs of 24 expressionless heads. I could feel the cold, hard-packed earth under my own worn boots. I could smell the cloying scent of dust and decay and something else, something faint and sweet like old paper and dried flowers. The silver light was all around me, cold on my skin. And then the memory came, crashing down on me not as a recollection, but as a direct, terrifying, present-tense experience. I remembered everything. I had been here last night. The crooked spire hadn't beckoned me. It had pulled me off the highway with an invisible hook of psychic gravity. I had parked my rig in this exact spot and walked into this chapel, not out of fear or curiosity, but with a sense of weary, bone-deep relief, like a man coming home after a long and terrible war. The preacher, a tall, skeletal man named Silas, whose face I could now see perfectly in my mind's eye, a face of carved bone and burning eyes, had spoken to us, but not with words. His thoughts had simply appeared in our heads, cool and serene. He had offered us a trade, a moment of true peace, a brief, perfect respite from the relentless forward march of our lives, from the crushing burden of our memories, our shames, our regrets, our fears. All he asked for in return was a small toll, a memory, a single, specific memory of our choosing, a tithe to the silence of the place. I remembered offering up the memory of my conversation with Elias, the entire night. From the moment I picked him up to the moment I arrived here, I had willingly, gratefully handed it over. I had felt it being lifted from me, a cool, pleasant sensation, like a surgeon precisely excising a tumor from my soul. In exchange, I was granted a few hours of perfect, thoughtless peace, standing in silent, empty communion with these other lost souls. Elias wasn't a hitchhiker I was bringing here. He was the shepherd, the collector, sent out to the road to find weary travelers and lead them back for the shearing. My eyes, in this horrific, vivid memory vision, were drawn to a man standing 2 rows ahead of me. A heavy-set man in a worn red flannel jacket with a tired, defeated slump to his shoulders that I knew better than my own name. With a jolt of absolute soul-shattering terror, I realized I was looking at myself, or a version of myself. This Sal, this other Sal, looked even more hollowed out than the rest. His eyes were fixed on the altar, where I now saw that the symbol of the preacher wasn't a cross, but a carving of a small, crooked bird. And I understood with horrifying clarity that this other Sal had given up more than a memory. He had given up the road. He had paid a different, higher toll and had chosen to stay, to become a permanent resident of the Shepherd's Rest. The vision shattered. I was back in my cab, gasping for air, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird trying to break free. I looked at the chapel. It was dark again, utterly empty. Elias and the entire congregation were gone. The strange silver light was gone. There was nothing but a derelict ruin in the cold light of the rising moon. Part 6. The Toll in the Open Road. For a long moment that stretched into an eternity, I just sat there, the echo of that impossible vision screaming through the silent chambers of my mind. The sudden, absolute silence that rushed back in was worse than the ringing had been. It was the silence of a vacuum, the sound of absence. Was it real? Was it a dream? A complex and vivid hallucination brought on by 36 hours without sleep and the insidious power of suggestion from a very strange, very convincing man. My hand was shaking so badly I could barely grip the gear shift. My eyes, wide with terror, darted frantically around the cab, searching for proof, for anything to confirm or deny what I'd just seen. My gaze fell upon the sun visor, the spot where Maria's picture was supposed to be, my anchor, my reality. With a trembling, clumsy hand, I reached up and flipped it down. The photograph was gone. My heart seized, a painful physical clench in my chest. I fumbled, patting the dashboard, the seat, the floor, my mind scrabbling for a rational explanation. It must have just fallen out. The rough road, the vibrations. But my search was frantic and fruitless. It wasn't there. It was gone. And in its place, tucked neatly and precisely into the worn elastic band where Maria's laughing, vibrant face had been just an hour ago, was a small, crudely carved object. It was a bird, a tiny wooden bird, whittled from some pale, soft wood. Its shape was simple, almost abstract, but its head was cocked at a distinct, inquisitive angle. It was cool to the touch. I didn't need to be told what it was. In the depths of the memory I had just relived, I remembered seeing its image everywhere in that chapel. It was the symbol carved into the crumbling stone of the altar. It was the mark of the shepherd, Silas's mark. This was my receipt, my proof of transaction, the price of my passage through their silent domain. And with that realization came another, even more horrific one. It wasn't just the memory of the conversation they had taken. That had been the appetizer, the down payment, the key to get me back here to settle the real bill. The true toll, the one I'd paid last night in that state of blissful, willing ignorance, was the core of the memory that conversation had been about. The near miss on the ice, the heart-stopping fear of losing Maria, the deep, abiding love and longing that made that old, faded photograph the most precious and powerful thing in my truck. They hadn't just taken the story. They had taken the feeling behind it. I tried to summon her face in my mind, to hold on to her image as a shield against this horror. But the image that came was blurry, indistinct, like a photograph left in the rain. The sharp, aching, fierce love I always felt when I looked at her picture was gone. It had been replaced by a dull, hollow ache, the phantom pain of an amputated limb. I knew I loved her, as a fact, as a piece of data, but I couldn't feel it anymore. They had scooped it out of me and left an empty space, A wave of revulsion and terror so powerful it almost made me black out washed over me. I finally broke free from my paralysis. I slammed the gear shift into reverse so hard the transmission screamed in protest. I stomped on the accelerator and the truck lurched backward, the trailer swinging wildly, nearly jackknifing. The skeletal branches of the dead trees scraped and screeched along the side of my trailer like the fingernails of the damned on a chalkboard. I didn't look back at the chapel. I couldn't. I was terrified that if I did, I would see it lit up again, with that hollowed-out version of myself standing in the doorway watching me leave. I found the service road and floored it, the big truck bucking and rattling violently over the rutted path. I didn't slow down, didn't breathe until my tires hit the blessed, solid, real asphalt of the interstate. I merged without looking, without signaling, laying on the horn, a long, desperate, mournful blast into the empty, uncaring night. I drove for an hour, maybe two, I don't know. The sun was starting to bleed over the eastern horizon, painting the sky in pale, washed-out shades of pink and gray that looked sickly and wrong. I finally pulled over at the first bright, garishly lit, noisy truck plaza I came to. It felt like reaching a lifeboat after drowning. I stumbled out of my rig, leaving the engine running and the door hanging wide open. I walked past the fuel pumps, past the other drivers starting their day with coffee and cigarettes, men living in a world that still made sense. And I just kept walking. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I couldn't get back in that cab. Not with that little wooden bird tucked in the visor, not with that hollow space where my heart used to be. That's when you found me, Sal finished. His story hung in the air between us, thick and heavy and cold. He looked utterly broken, a man who had been psychically plundered. We drove the last few miles to a Greyhound station in a small sleeping town. The fluorescent lights of the terminal cast a lonely, sterile glow on the wet pavement. I pulled up to the curb. "What will you do now?" I asked him, the question feeling impossibly small. Sal shrugged, a gesture of complete, abject defeat. "Take a bus. Go home. I don't know. Try to explain to my wife why her picture is gone. Try to figure out how to live with her, how to look at her every day, knowing that the most important part of my love for her was stolen from me on some forgotten road in Nebraska." He opened the car door, then paused and looked back at me, his eyes full of a terrible, quiet warning. "Be careful out here," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "The roads are old, Jack. Older than the concrete. And they get hungry." He got out, shut the door gently, and walked into the station without looking back, a silhouette of a man running from his own shadow. I pulled away, heading back to the highway, back to the night. As I drove, I couldn't shake the image of that crooked spire, of that silent, waiting congregation. I thought about all the miles I've driven, all the forgotten places I've passed in the dark. I wondered how many memories I've lost to the road, what invisible tolls I've paid for safe passage without ever knowing it. Our pasts are what anchor us, what tell us who we are. But out here, in the great, lonely dark of the American night, sometimes the past gets thin. And there are things waiting in the silence, in the empty spaces between the mile markers, ready to offer you peace for a price you don't even remember paying.